Okay, so the Enlightenment, I've talked about that before. You might recall that the Enlightenment was that period of time in Western history when the institutions of Western civilization, be they academic, economic, political, adopted the idea that what is universal about human beings is not religion. Okay, so think about this in terms of the Reformation that's just taken place. Christianity is broken off into Roman Catholicism, and not just Lutheranism, but Calvinism and about 5 other Protestant groups. So obviously religion doesn't hold us together anymore, right? We're fragmented. So in its search for something that unifies Western civilization, the powers that be decided that, well, look at science. Science has been extremely successful. People like Galileo and Copernicus figured out that the planets revolve around the sun, not the other way around. And Sir Isaac Newton has given us a mathematical formula for the force of gravity, so we got that figured out. I mean, science was making all kinds of progress. So obviously, science and reason was the thing that would unify the human race. Not only that, but science and reason would enable us to begin to understand the problems that have plagued the human race from the beginning of time, but which we have not been able to figure out because the forces of superstition and this idea that the world is divided up into a spiritual realm and the realm of space, time, and matter, this idea is a human illusion. Okay? The only thing that's real is the world of space, time, and matter. The world that we can study, see, and touch, and understand. So we're going to figure things out. Things are going to get better, and we're going to make progress. And pretty soon the human race will take its future and its destiny into its own hands because we will understand the problems that make for poverty and hunger and disease and all those evils that have plagued the human race from the beginning of time. We'll get it figured out. Okay? That was the optimism of the 19th century. And then you might recall I pointed out that the unfortunate thing about, you see, science is broken down into 2 categories. There are hard sciences and there are soft sciences, right? Hard sciences are the sciences that can be strictly understood through real world results. All right, so for example, biology, medicine. We know that the vaccines for smallpox and polio work. How do we know that? Because those diseases have been eradicated by and large, right? Now, this has caused a certain amount of confusion with respect to the vaccine for COVID-19 because to begin with, people thought this is going to protect you from getting the virus. But then Omicron came along and people realized, no, you can still get infected, but what it'll do is it'll protect you from hospitalization and death. Okay? So, but here again, even though the COVID-19 vaccine didn't turn out to be as effective as the smallpox vaccine, the polio vaccine, nevertheless, scientists used real-world data to determine what we could or could not say about a particular thing that was under study, right? Okay, Okay, so hard sciences can verify the truth of something, whereas soft sciences like sociology and political science and even psychology to some degree can make predictions about human behavior, but oftentimes when you study history you discover that their predictions didn't work out the way they thought they would. And the role of religion in particular is an example of this, okay? So whether you're a post-enlightenment thinker and you believe that there is such a thing as truth and reason and science get us there, or you're a post-enlightenment thinker and you believe that no, not so much, truth is more relative to the person who is promoting whatever it is they say is the truth, and it really just represents their point of view, not necessarily the point of view of people from other cultures and other places. Irrespective of whether you fall on one side or the other, people believe that as the world modernized, industrialized, and now has become more technologically savvy, that as that happened, religion would eventually die off. The more we understood for ourselves, and the more we could understand the world and take our own future into our own hands, and solve these terrible problems that have plagued us for so many years, religion would eventually die off, because there would be nothing to pray for anymore, because we would have solved all those problems. Why would you pray for illness when all you have to do is go to the doctor and you get cured? Okay. Or hunger. We would be able to, through the use of scientific method, figure out how to produce more food, and we can eradicate hunger. And on it goes. Whatever problem you're talking about, it was believed that science and reason would somehow enable us to get out from under that particular problem, and religion would begin to disappear. Well, the interesting thing about studying history is that you discover how our most certain conclusions about human life oftentimes don't turn out to be correct. Right? So, this point of view that modernization would lead to the downfall of religion, and eventually religion would just go away. This point of view was held, I remember when I started college in the early 70s. I went to West Valley Community College in Saratoga. And I did not have one instructor that did not repeat the same refrain about religion over and over again. I didn't accept it, but I wasn't going to argue with them either because I wanted a good grade. Okay? So they didn't affect me personally. But I listened to their arguments, okay? And then along came the administration of Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was an evangelical Christian. How can we be having an evangelical Christian in the White House? Religion is supposed to go away. And then you had the Iranian Revolution. What's this with the Muslims anyway? They're becoming even more radical than they used to be. And then you had, after that, the rise of the so-called moral majority. Remember them? Okay? All of a sudden, religion is getting an outsized influence on public policy rather than a smaller influence. And then there's the rise of megachurches during the 80s and the 90s. And this is not even to consider the fact that in the rest of the world, especially the world where the attempt was made to stamp out religion, such as in Stalinist Russia, Maoist China, and some of the right-wing regimes in Central America and South America, religion actually behaved in the same way it did when Christianity was born in the Roman world. The more they tried to stamp it out, the bigger it got. In all of those places. And now today, if you travel to Eastern Europe, the churches are full. I don't know how active the church is in Russia today, but I think it's pretty active. And in Central and South America, Christianity is growing. It's growing in Africa, and it's growing in China. So the idea that modernization would lead to the downfall of religion turned out to be false, and people eventually abandoned that idea entirely. So recently I've been listening, when I drive to church in the morning, I have something called audiobooks on this thing, and it connects to Bluetooth. I've been listening to a book by Desmond Tutu. Remember him? Okay. Desmond Tutu recently wrote a book called God Has a Dream. And in that book, he recounts what happened in South Africa in order to effect the downfall of apartheid. And he says explicitly in that book, and of course he knew Nelson Mandela very well, he says explicitly in that book, it was not any political ideology that led to the downfall of apartheid. It was the Bible. He said those people wanted to stop the deconstruction of this segregationist society. The book they should have banned was the Bible. Why is that? Because, he said, the Bible taught us that God's love is equal for all people. God cherishes all people equally. Number two, that you can see what God's will looks like in the world through the ministry and life and death of Jesus Christ. Okay? And number three, that through the prophets and through Jesus, God has been addressing the problem of evil in all of its forms and in many ways from the beginning of the birth of Israel down to the present day. Okay? So it wasn't a political philosophy that did it, it was a religious faith that did it. And that led people then to the conclusion that Christianity actually could become a force for good rather than, as what was thought previously, a force that divided and caused even more problems than it helped to solve. We have an example of how this works in ancient Rome. Okay, once Christianity was established as a legal religion in ancient Rome in the 300s AD, 4th century, by a guy named Constantine. Okay, it was the largest religion and still growing in ancient Rome. Following Constantine, there came along, I don't know the exact years, but there was an emperor who decided that he wanted to reintroduce the good old days when they worshipped pagan gods. His name was Julian the Apostate. Okay. And Julian couldn't understand why Christianity was growing and paganism was shrinking. So he took a look around the empire. He looked at these different communities, the Christian community and the pagan community. And he noticed that Christians did things that pagans didn't do. Number one, they took care of their widows and orphans. Number two, if anybody was hungry, they were cared for. Number three, they cared for their sick. Number four, he quotes one guy who says, look at these people, they love each other. He says, we pagans have to copy that model, and maybe we can bring the paganism back again. So he tried to get the pagan priests to act like Christian leaders, right? But it didn't work, and it's a simple reason why it didn't work. The pagan gods didn't behave the way Jesus behaved. Okay? That's why it didn't work. There was no model. There was no foundation for the values. Okay? So as Western civilization began to grow and build, the values that shaped Western civilization came from Christianity. They didn't come from paganism. Which is why in the Western world we had tons of church-sponsored hospitals, because part of Jesus' ministry was caring for the sick. We had social service agencies like Lutheran Social Services, which feeds the hungry and cares for the homeless, etc., to the extent that they have the ability to do that. And we advocate that government should take much of the responsibility for making sure that everybody's fed and cared for and has at least a minimum of their needs met. Right? This is all based on values that have come from the Christian tradition. Right? So, so whether you're philosophically oriented toward the Enlightenment, reason and science, or toward postmodernism, no, all truth is relative. Nevertheless, the values that both sides work for, a more just and peaceful world, a world where everyone is taken care of, and on it goes, those values came from the spiritual roots of Western civilization, which is Christianity. That's where they came from. Right? There's just, people began to realize eventually that that's where they came from. So this leads us into where I want to go today in this issue of the Bible and evil. Okay? The question I want to take a look at today is, what does Jesus have to do with it? Okay, so we talked in the Old Testament about the certain ideas that the Bible has about evil in the Old Testament. But once we get to the New Testament, how is the problem of evil looked at from the point of view of Jesus of Nazareth? Now, first of all, what's the source of our knowledge of Jesus? The written source. Yes. And more specifically, there's 4 books in the New Testament. Which one? And what do we call those? Gospels. Okay. What does gospel mean? Good news, exactly. Now, it's important for you to know that it wasn't the Christians who invented the idea of writing down good news, gospels. They borrowed that from the Romans. The Romans, when Caesar Augustus won the civil war in Rome, he ushered in a period of peace and prosperity into the Roman Empire, and the Romans called the story of that gospel. Good news. The good news of Caesar. The emperor reigns, and we have peace and prosperity. So when this little band of Christians from Galilee comes along and says, no, there's another gospel. It's about a guy who was a crucified criminal, Jesus of Nazareth. Of course, the Romans would have thought these people are nuts. Another example of those stiff-necked Jews who won't listen to reason, right? They had quite a reputation in the ancient world. The Jews, that is. So the Christians come along with this new story of good news. Okay, so the question then is, well, what is the good news? Why is the story of Jesus good news? All right. Now, any story, if you think about the Gospels for a minute, any story has an overall plot and it has subplots. okay? Sub-stories. Okay, for example, suppose we were reading a Shakespeare play like, oh, I don't know, Hamlet. Hamlet has an overall plot, which is that Hamlet has the tragic flaw of not correcting his uncle's chicanery, who murdered his father, the rightful king, and he stole the throne. Okay, and Hamlet knew this, and by rights he should have, gone after his uncle and thrown him off the throne and taken the throne himself. Okay, that's the overall plot. The subplots have Hamlet, wringing his hands, and there's a part of it where he gets involved with a young woman, and there's all kinds of, and his friend Horatio, there's all kinds of subplots behind it that all flow into the overall plot. Right? Same way with Jesus. We have lots of subplots in the overall plot of the good news of Jesus Christ. Okay? The subplots that I'm talking about are the miracle stories. Okay? Now, the miracle stories can be broken down into several kinds of categories. The miracle stories of Jesus. And this is important because it illustrates how Jesus addresses different forms of evil in his society. All right? So let's start out with casting out demons. All right. Jesus was known for casting out demons. Now, those of us who are born in a post-enlightenment scientific age wonder about this issue of demons. Was there really demons or not? In the end, it doesn't make any difference one way or the other whether there was really demons or something else. It doesn't matter what a person believes about that. The issue is who has power and control. Whatever it is that has taken power and control over the possessed person or Jesus. Who has the power and control? Now, the way these possessed folks were oftentimes described in the Gospels is they were considered to be mad out of their minds. Oftentimes, it is observed that they frothed at the mouth. They weren't in control of themselves or their faculties, and people were afraid of them. They would shun them off somewhere. Like, remember when Jesus comes off the boat on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and he runs into that demoniac in the cemetery. The guy who has a legion of demons. Remember him? Okay? All right, so the demons, when they encounter Jesus, they shriek. What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? We know who you are. They're afraid of him. And he confronts the demons, right? And in this particular story, the demons say, well, if you're going to cast us out of this guy, put us into that herd of pigs over there. So he does. He puts them into that herd of pigs. And what do the pigs do? They commit suicide. They all commit suicide. Okay, it's a good Jewish story. The pigs all commit suicide. Okay? All right? So what's the point of this? The point is that a source of evil has taken possession of a human being whom God loves and wants to restore, and that's exactly what God does. The point is that Jesus has more power than the power of evil has. Now, in the gospel stories, we are appraised of this before Jesus even begins his ministry, because after he's baptized, what happens to him? Goes off in the wilderness, right? And what happens there? He's tempted by the devil. 3 temptations, which typify human temptations. Temptations for wealth, temptations for power, and so forth, okay? And he overcomes every one of those temptations by quoting the Word of God. All right? So we already know that evil is attacking him. All right? It's after him. Okay? So, the first thing he does actually is cast out a demon in the synagogue in Capernaum, depending on which gospel you read. But that appears to be the first thing he does. Okay, secondly, Jesus heals lepers. Now, this is an interesting case because with lepers, what you're dealing with here is not only a disease, but a source of uncleanness in the presence of God. All right, so this is the way lepers are treated. First of all, it's important to understand that a leper was anyone with a skin disease. All right, not just what we call Hansen's disease. Anyone with any kind of skin disease was considered a leper. All right? And if a healthy person came in contact with a leper, the healthy person was made unclean. Because number one, they might have gotten the disease. But even if they didn't, they were unclean before God because leprosy is a source of evil. And they had to go through a series of ritual cleansings before they could return to normal life. Now, when Jesus comes along, instead of the leprosy being transferred to him, what happens? His power is transferred to the leprosy, and the person is healed. So who's in control? Jesus is in control. Okay? So first you got the demons, where he demonstrates his control over an influence that is evil. Then you've got leprosy, where Jesus demonstrates that his power casts out the disease just like it cast out a demon. And once again, rather than him becoming unclean, the person he heals becomes clean. Okay. Then we've got stories about Jesus raising people from the dead. Remember the story about the little girl in the village of Nain? Okay? So we've got this, I don't remember if it's I think it's a father who's just out of his mind with grief. Well, the girl is dying, or has died. And Jesus says, okay, take me to her. Now, here again is another one of those examples where if you come in contact with something, you become unclean before God and you have to go through a series of ritual cleansings. There's a reference of this made when Jesus turns water into wine. Remember, the story says there were jugs of water for ritual cleansing available, and he turned that water into wine. Okay. All right, so he goes into the house where this little girl has died. Now, in the ancient world, if a Jew came in contact with a corpse, they had to go through this ritual cleansing, right? Because death is a source of evil. And therefore, you need to be cleansed of that influence in order to be right with God. Okay? Jesus walks into the house. He takes the hand of the dead girl. Okay, so he's already made himself unclean. All right? And he says, Talitha kum, which is Aramaic for little girl, rise. She gets up. He restores her to her parents. Once again, what happens is that instead of the evil going to him, he overcomes the evil and gets rid of it. And life overcomes death. Okay, now it's becoming clear by this point to his disciples and to others who know him. And by the way, you know, the historical evidence that he did these things is pretty overwhelming, because one of the criteria that historians use to determine whether a thing has actually happened or not is they depend on there having been multiple sources, multiple witnesses that it happened. Okay? So with Jesus, we have the Gospel of John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are considered one source because they're interdependent. So you've got the Synoptic Gospels, you've got the Gospel of John. You've got Josephus, the Jewish historian, who said that Jesus did these things. And then you've got the Talmud, which are sayings of the rabbis who accuse him of sorcery. So once again, that's 4 sources telling us that Jesus was known to do these so-called startling deeds, quote unquote. Okay? So that he was able to do what we call miracles is pretty clear historically. Most people who know the history don't even question it anymore, even those who don't believe in it. All right, so, but it's important also to understand in context that some of these healings are not just healing from a disease. They're also freeing the person from a source of evil and uncleanness in the sight of God, as is leprosy, death, and remember the incident in the Gospel of Mark where the Pharisees confront Jesus and say, why doesn't your disciples wash their pots and pans before they eat? This was ritual cleansing. Okay, and Jesus' response was, you might recall, that it's not what goes into a person that defiles that person, because it goes into him and then out the sewer. It's what comes out of a person that defiles. Evil thoughts, and murder, and adultery, and this and that, and stealing, and whatever. Okay, that's what defiles a person. Okay, so he has a completely different point of view from that of the religious elites of his day. Okay, so once the early Christian community then gets established, okay, they understand it as their mission to recreate Jesus' ministry in the world, which is why caring for the sick became an integral part of early Christian living. And on into even the 20th century, when I first was called to that church in Baltimore I served, there was a Lutheran hospital in Baltimore. Went out of business because it couldn't pay the bills, but for a while it was there. And of course, we all know there's a lot of Catholic hospitals.
Herb and I went to a church in Baltimore, and they had a nurse on their staff.
Oh, they did? Yeah, she was probably, maybe she was called the deaconess?
I don't know what to call her, nurse.
Really?
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's in keeping with Christian tradition, okay, which is the idea that we are responsible to carry on the ministry of Jesus. All right? So he has confronted sources of evil in demons, in leprosy as an unclean disease, in the power of death. And then there's that fascinating story about the woman who has a problem with bleeding that won't stop. Remember that one? Okay, she's in a crowd, right? And she can't get his attention because there's too many people around. But it says that the gospel writer, I think it was Luke, I was positive it's Luke, because Luke always puts all of his attention on women. You should read Luke. He likes women, okay? So Luke says that she had consulted many physicians, spent all her money, and none of them could help her. All right? But eventually she gets close enough to him that she grabs the hem of his garment. And what happens next? She's healed. What does he feel? Do you remember what the story says about what he feels? That's right. His power went out from him. Okay, he feels that. All right? It's the same thing again. Power goes out of him. Instead of him becoming unclean, because blood made you unclean, you had to go through ritual cleansing if you came in contact with blood. Instead of him becoming unclean, he makes her clean. Okay? So you have all these reversals. So they're not just miracle stories, they're reversals, where sources of evil are turned on their head and eradicated and done away with through his power. Okay? Now this is what the early Jews would have understood when they read these stories. Okay? Because they were obviously, this is part of their tradition, and they understood what was going on. All right, now, what about the more pedestrian stories of Jesus making the blind to see, the lame to walk, and the deaf to hear? There are those too. Do those have anything to do with ritual cleansing? And the answer is no, they don't. But they are connected to the Old Testament in that the prophet Isaiah specifically said, and this is the text that Jesus read in Nazareth when he began his ministry. The prophet Isaiah said, when the Messiah comes, the deaf will hear, the blind will see, and the lame will walk. Okay? So that is exactly what he does. He makes the blind see, the lame walk, and the deaf hear. Thus fulfilling what God said through the prophet Isaiah would happen when the power of God's kingdom came to the earth. Okay, not that we go to God's kingdom, but that God's kingdom came here through Jesus Christ. The power of God's kingdom comes here. Okay, the next group of stories, and there's actually two of them, we oftentimes talk about the feeding of the 5,000. And okay, this is a patriarchal society, right? Those 5,000 are what? Men. It's all men. It says, besides the women and children. So you might ask yourself the question, well, why didn't they count the women and children? Especially when you consider the fact that Jesus in his ministry seems to value women and children more than he does men. Over and over again. Yeah. The fact that the gospel writers actually recorded that in a patriarchal society is in and of itself remarkable. All right, that they would have recorded, because other Jews would say, what? This guy can't be a Messiah. He's paying attention to women and children who are not of any great value. Now there are two stories of feeding massive numbers of people. One is 5,000. How many is the other one? 4,000. That's right. There's two of those. Okay? But the remarkable thing about both of these stories is that Jesus does not start from scratch, does he? He doesn't produce food out of nothing. What does he produce it out of? What's there, exactly. He asks for what's there. 5 loaves and 2 fish, or whatever it was. So he doesn't start from scratch. He starts from an offering. Okay? Now the early church interpreted that to mean that all Christians were responsible, if you read the book of Acts, this becomes very clear, were responsible to bring a generous offering into the church so that the deacons who were ordained to service, not to preaching the word, so that the deacons could feed the widows, the orphans, the poor, and the hungry. Okay? So, there again, the story of the feeding of those massive numbers of people from a small offering becomes a model for the early church in its ministry. And it acts in the same way that Jesus did, except they don't multiply the loaves and fishes. Well, actually they do multiply them, but how do they multiply them? By getting everybody to contribute. That's how. Yeah. If you've got everybody contributing, you're multiplying. It's not a miracle. Well, maybe it is a miracle. If you can get enough people to contribute, that's pretty miraculous. Feed a lot of people. All right, and ever since then, the church has been involved. What is one of the most impressive aspects of the ministry of the ELCA? Which arm of the church is perhaps the most impressive one? ELCA Hunger Appeal. They're active around the world. Yeah. Feeding people. Digging wells in villages. Teaching farmers techniques that will increase crop yield. All of these kinds of things, ELCA Hunger is involved in. And over 90% of what you give to that goes to actual ministry rather than to administration. So they do a very good job of that. That particular arm of the church is one that I personally think is very good. Okay? All right, now if you put all these subplots together, Jesus is casting out demons, he's healing lepers, he's raising the dead, he's healing the blind, the lame, and the deaf, and he's feeding the hungry. If you put all these together and ask, what is the theme of every one of these stories, what would it be? Yeah, okay, but what is he actually addressing? What is he addressing?
Evil.
Exactly. At the very heart of the Christian faith is that we have a Savior who addresses head-on the problem of evil. It's just as clear as crystal. Okay. So the problem of evil is not an issue that Christianity does not deal with. It's right at the heart of Christianity. And, okay, so, and that's just in the subplots. Okay, and the subplots all feed into the overall plot. And the overall plot has to do with Jesus' death on the cross, right? So, if you read the lead up to Good Friday, and you carefully look at all of the influences that are going on, conspiring to put Jesus on the cross, what you'll discover is that it's not just one thing. There's all kinds of influences that are going into this. Okay, so there's the lack of faith on the part of the disciples when Jesus is praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. What do? They fall asleep. Yeah. Couldn't you just stay awake for, apparently they couldn't. They fell asleep. Then there's Peter. What does he do? Never knew the family 3 times. Never knew them. They don't know anything about it. Then there's Judas. What does he do? He betrays him. Right? Now, some people think Judas was trying to force Jesus' hand. Some people think Judas believed that Jesus was this coming king who would instigate a revolution, a violent revolution. He was trying to force him into it. Others think it was just greed. We don't know. But several of the gospel writers do say that Judas committed suicide after it happened. So he obviously had remorse, right, about what he did. All right, so you got the disciples who aren't particularly helpful. The rest of them, what happens to the rest of them?
Most of them were martyred.
Oh, eventually, but I mean, while this is going on, what happens to them? They hid. Yeah, they ran away. Right. All right. A few people stayed. Who stayed? A bunch of women. That's right. Yeah, a bunch of women stayed. Okay. All right, so the disciples skedaddle. So what does this tell you about human failure in the face of evil? Well, one of the most obvious human failures in the face of evils that we run into is that we're afraid of it and we run away from it. it's maybe possible for us to do that, we tend not to want to do that because it stirs up controversy. So that's the disciples. Okay, how about the high priest? What's his role in all this? Well, he comes up with this kangaroo court, right? And he lies about what Jesus has actually done. And basically, it's summed up in that passage in John where the high priest says, it's better that we sacrifice one man than that the whole people might have to suffer. In other words, the high priest is afraid that Jesus is stirring up the crowds, that the Romans might come after them, so he wants to get rid of it as fast as he can, before he has a chance to stir up the crowds and get the Romans angry. Right? So he's full of lies and deceit, and he convicts Jesus of crimes he can commit. And then there's the role of Pilate. What does he do?
Comes upon somebody else.
Yeah, he tries to. But Pilate is the perfect example of a leader who can't lead. What does he do? He folds. That's right, he folds under the pressure of the crowd. The crowd says, crucify him. He says, well, what has he done? It specifically says in the gospel text, Pilate perceived that they turned him over out of jealousy. So he knew that Jesus was not a criminal. He knew that. But he folded. He didn't have the backbone. Yeah, didn't have the backbone, right? So he folds. He turns him over to be crucified, and then now the soldiers have him. What do? They mock him, make fun of him, they hit him, they flog him, they put a fake purple robe on him, crown of thorns, say, "Hail, King of the Jews," blah, 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 on and on. Okay, so you've got cruelty on top of injustice, lies, deceit, fear, all of it. Okay, all of it is a massive cauldron of human failure in the face of evil. All of it. It's like the devil mustered all the power he has over humanity and focused it right on Jesus. Because all of them have a role in it. Nobody has clean hands. Not one person. So what conclusion can we come to then about Jesus' crucifixion on the cross? Who's he there in place of? Okay, so all of those aspects of human failure in the face of evil put him on the cross, which means he is doing the suffering and the dying for the rest of us who fail in the face of evil. Does that make sense? Okay? That's what the story is telling us. All right? So remember the biblical view that, number one, evil runs through the hearts of all people. We all have the potential, through omission or commission, to commit acts that are ultimately evil. And two, there's a source of the evil that is stronger than the human will to resist it. You see all that going on in the gospel stories. that's how Jesus ends up on the cross. All right. So this becomes then the climax of the plot that actually creates the Christian faith. Jesus has been confronting evil throughout his entire ministry in all of its forms. Hunger, disease, uncleanness, death, all of it. He even stilled a storm, natural evil. Okay? So you got it all in one small text. It's all rolled up into one ministry. And then at the end, you've got this one guy who's been able to overcome and confront evil at all levels of its existence, ending up on a cross because all those around him failed to confront evil. So he ends up paying the price. He ends up being the atonement for the sin of the rest of us. He pays the price. All right, so the only thing left to do for us then as Christians who are studying the subject of evil, the only thing left for us to do now is to talk about what does the resurrection mean, okay? And how is it that this band of followers of Jesus is able eventually over time to so multiply itself that it overcomes the entire power of the Roman world without ever drawing blood, but having its own blood spilled many times. How is that possible? That will complete the study. Okay? Questions or comments?
Maybe this is just TV shows or movies, but is it possible that houses can be full of evil and that the priests and everything have to come and try to clean the house of evil spirits? Or is that just movies doing that?
So,
and Ghostbusters and that kind of thing.
yeah, right. Well, Hollywood turns everything into a joke. You have to bear that in mind. But if you look at the reality of it, okay, so there still is the belief in the Roman Catholic Church that there is such a thing as demonic possession. It's demonic possession. And some Catholic priests have been taught how to do exorcisms.
Yes.
I don't think all of them have, but some of them have. So it is present in Roman Catholicism. It is not present in Protestant churches. So does it happen?